Hello everyone, and welcome back to If It's Math. Today we're continuing our series on real numbers as part of our Fundamentals of Algebra content. So far we've gone through set notation, common number sets, properties of real numbers, graphing points on a number line, and what inequalities are. So in this video we'll learn about how to graph inequalities on a number line. So by the end of this video you'll understand how to graph a single inequality, how to graph compound inequalities, and how to graph the union of inequalities. So let's get started with a quick recap. So the best way to graph an inequality on a number line is to first put your inequality into interval notation. So let's quickly go back over how to do that. So remember that interval notation takes an inequality such as, let's say 2 is less than x, which is less than or equal to 6. And so you take that and turn it into this much easier to write interval notation. So the key thing to doing interval notation, remember, is that if you have parentheses, that's going to equate to less than, and if you have brackets, that's going to equate to less than or equal to. So let's look at a couple of examples of interval notation just to be sure we're remembering what we're doing there. So if you had -1 is less than or equal to x, which is less than 8, you're going to turn this into -1 to 8. And the reason you use the bracket here is because you have the or equal to at the beginning. And the reason you use the parentheses here is because you do not have that or equal to there. So this first inequality will tell you what symbol to use, and the second inequality will tell you what symbol to use there. So let's do one more just to be sure. So if we had 3 is less than x, which is less than 19, you're going to first do your numbers, so 3 and 19. And then because this does not have an an or equal to there, that's going to be a parentheses. And then the same thing here, because there's no or equal to, you know that this is also going to be parentheses. Because that's all there is. So remember, you just write in your numbers, -1 and 8. If it is or equal to, that's going to give you the bracket. If it's not, that's going to give you the parentheses. So one important reminder also about working with interval notation is that, sometimes you don't have a compound inequality. Sometimes it's a simple one. So if you have x is greater than 7, remember there what we did to get into interval notation is we want everything in the less than direction. So 7 is less than x. And then when you're in that situation, remember there's almost like an understood infinity in there. So 7 is less than x, which is less than infinity. So then you can take this to interval notation because you have the parts you're used to. So you're going to do 7 and infinity. And because there's no or equal to here, you know that you're going to use that parentheses at the beginning. And then the other rule, remember, is that if it's infinity, it's always going to take the parentheses. Another way to even think about that is you're never going to be less than or equal to infinity. So there's no or equal to, so you're going to have this parentheses there. So one more just to be sure with those simple inequalities, they can be tricky. If you have x is less than or equal to -1, then remember that's going to be the equivalent of negative infinity is less than x, not or equal to. Remember, I just said that rule. So you're going to have negative infinity is less than x, less than or equal to -1. So then you're going to have negative infinity to -1 with the bracket because you did have, again, that or equal to gives you that bracket. So the other important quick recap is using graphing points on a number line. So we're not going to be graphing points, we're graphing inequalities, but you sort of have to remember what you're doing in that space. So for graphing points on a number line, remember it's just really finding where the number falls and then putting the dot there. So let's say you had the points, let's do x equals -3 and the point of x equals 2. So you want to figure out where these numbers are. So if you're looking at -3, that's right here. So we're going to end up putting a dot there. And 2 falls here. So we'll end up putting a dot there. So -3 there, and then 2 right there. And that's all there is to doing the points. We're going to be extending that a little bit further with our interval notation, but that's how you, remember, that's how you graph points on that number line. Okay, so when we think about the steps to actually graphing an inequality, there's 3 of them. So you'll probably see why we recapped the things that we just did. So thinking about step 1, you're going to put the inequality into interval form. That's why we had to refresh on that. So that's the first step. Then on step 2, you're going to draw the number line and then graph the numbers. But instead of using dots, what you're going to use is whatever symbols you had in that interval notation. So where you would typically put a dot, you're either going to put a left or right parenthesis or a left or right bracket. And we'll walk through this in just a second. But then the thing that really moves it on from what you did with regular number lines is this step of where you're shading the number between the symbols. So you're going to graph the 2 points and then shade in between them. So let's take a look at how to actually do this. Okay, so let's say we wanted to graph the inequality x is less than 2. So the first step is to get this into interval notation. So we have x is less than 2. And remember, whenever you have that, you've got this implied infinity in there. So negative infinity is less than x is less than 2. So then you know that the interval notation for this is going to be negative infinity to 2. And we have parentheses on both ends because there is no or equal to with this. Okay. So then step 2 with this is draw the number line, which we have already here digitally, and then graph the numbers using the parentheses or the brackets instead of the dots. So what's important here is to pay attention to what direction it is when it's touching the number. So for the 2, we have the parentheses like this. So when we do the 2 on the number line, what we're going to do is use that same symbol. So we're looking for the 2. If we were doing this for just the point, you would do a dot. But because we're doing this in equality, what you're going to have is a parenthesis, a right parenthesis, just like that. Now for infinity, there's nothing to actually graph, right? You can't put a dot on negative infinity. So then you go to shading the number line between the symbols. Well, it never stops going all the way to negative infinity. So what you're going to do is shade that line all the way down. And then since it does go to infinity, you're going to put an arrow saying this goes on forever. So this is actually the graph of x is less than 2. And when you take a look at it, it makes sense, right? So here was our 2 point. We're using this parenthesis because it's not or equal to. So this is telling us that any number to the left of 2, not including 2 because it's a parenthesis, is what we're looking at. So that's how you graph an inequality. So let's take a look at another one for some practice. So let's say you had x is greater than -1. So remember, step 1 is going to be to change that inequality into interval form. So we have x is greater than or equal to -1. We always want these in the less than direction. So that's the same as -1 being less than or equal to x. Then got that implied infinity. So -1 is less than or equal to x, which is less than infinity. So we're going to have for our interval form -1 and infinity. Infinity always uses parentheses, but because we have the or equal to now, we're going to use that left bracket. So again, -1 less than or equal to gives us the bracket. Infinity always uses that parentheses. Okay, so now we move on to actually graphing it. And same process. We're going to find our number. In this case, we're looking at -1. So that's here. And you use the exact symbol that's touching it in the same direction of what it is. So we're just going to take that bracket and put it on the -1. And then you're going to shade between the symbols. This goes all the way to infinity. So I can't graph infinity. So I just take that. And again, I'm going to put an arrow on the end to say that this goes on forever. So we've got this -1, turn into a bracket because it had the or equal to originally. Our infinity means we're going to have this arrow all the way to the right. And so graphically, you can see if we're trying to represent all numbers greater than or equal to 1, or -1, this gives you the equal to, and every number above that would satisfy this inequality. So that's how you graph x is greater than or equal to -1. Okay, so we've only done simple inequalities up till now. So let's take a look at compound inequalities and what you're going to want to do there. So the steps are the same. It just means you end up putting 2 symbols on the number line when we've only been doing 1 so far with simple inequalities. So we need to change this inequality into interval form. The good thing is these are actually a lot more straightforward, right? Than when you have infinities involved. So if you have -3 is less than x is less than or equal to 2. Remember, put in your 3 numbers. So I've got -3 and 2. At the beginning, there is no or equal to. So this is going to be parentheses. At the end part, there is an or equal to. So you're going to use the bracket. So that's our interval form for -3 is less than x, which is less than or equal to 2. So we're going to move on to step 2. So now we have 2 of them to graph. So we look at our -3. So that's going to put us here. And because it is a parentheses in this direction, that's what we're going to draw there. So on -3, we're going to do a left parentheses. Then our second number is this 2. So we find it right here. And we need to take this bracket there. So we're going to put a bracket on 2. And then just like before, you shade, but this time you do have 2. So you just shade whatever is in between. So that is the graph of -3 is less than x is less than or equal to 2. Again, you can see we've got less than because it's parentheses, and then less than or equal to because of the 2. And so anything that falls in this range is going to satisfy that inequality. Okay, one more just to be sure we've got it. So if we want to graph 4 is greater than x is greater than or equal to 1, remember, you always want to have it in the less than direction. So you're going to flip this all the way around. Make that 1 is less than or equal to x, which is less than 4. Get it into interval notation. So you have from 1 to 4. I have or equal to. So I'm going to end up with a bracket here. I do not have or equal to. So I'm going to end up with parentheses there. So that is the interval form of 4 is greater than x, which is greater than or equal to 1. So step 2, again, we're going to graph those using the symbols. So I've got 1 here, and I've got to use this left bracket because that's what's touching the 1. Let's go ahead and put that left bracket on 1. Then for 4, got parentheses. So here at 4, I need to draw that close parentheses. And then shade everything in between. And so that is the graph of 4 is greater than x, which is greater than or equal to 1. Again, just to recap it, you end up with bracket. You had the or equal to that lines up with that. And you have the parentheses because you did not have or equal to, and it lines up with that. Okay, y'all getting to be pros. Just one more thing to learn here. So that is graphing the unions of inequalities. So remember way back when you talked about what compound inequalities are. Compound inequalities were intersections. And so even when you read it, it's x is less than 2 is less than 6. So that's putting those two together. But sometimes you have a union. Remember, union, when we talked about set theory way back at the beginning, represents or. So what's happening in a union situation is that you have two separate inequalities. You're going to end up graphing those on the same number line. So let's take a look at these. If we have x is less than -3 or x is greater than or equal to 2. So let's get these in the less than direction just so it's easier to deal with. So we have x is less than -3 or 2 is less than or equal to x. So when you look at those, you can't combine them because they represent two very different things. So what we're going to do is exactly what we've done before. Go through the steps, and it's just you end up graphing two inequalities on the same number line. So step 1, we're going to change these inequalities to interval form. So let's start with the first one. If we have x is less than -3, that's going to give us -infinity is less than x is less than -3. So that is going to become -infinity, -3. There's no or equal to's here at all. So it's going to be parentheses for both of them. Then we move on to 2 is less than or equal to x. That's going to become 2 is less than or equal to x, which is less than infinity. So now I've got 2 and infinity. Infinity always uses a parenthesis, but in this case we do have or equal to. So this is going to be a bracket. So we have 2 now, and these don't overlap. So the next step is the same. You're just going to end up graphing two sets of them. So for our first inequality, we have -infinity and -3. So on my -3, I'm going to need a parentheses going that way. So we do right parentheses at -3. So like before, when we had these simple inequalities, you can't put a dot on -infinity. So you skip straight to the shading step and shade all the way that way with an arrow. So that's my graph for this first one of x is less than -3. So now we need to move on to this. We're going from 2 to infinity. Got a bracket. So here on the 2, I'm going to need to do a bracket. Again, a left bracket to line up with what's touching that 2. So do my left bracket. Same situation. Infinity, you can't put a dot on. So you're going to do a line going on forever across the number line with an arrow on the end. So that's what it looks like when you have a union. So you're saying it's this one or this one. So as long as something falls in either of those graphs, then it fits. So it might sound a little intimidating at first when you're saying that you need to graph the union of two inequalities. You just graph both inequalities, and that's all there is to that. Okay, so let's go through some practice. So won't do as much explanation with them because we're just sort of running it through kind of like a drill. So if you have x is less than 3, so let's get that into interval form. So x is less than 3 becomes negative infinity is less than x, which is less than 3. So that becomes negative infinity to 3. So then step 2, you're going to graph that number. So you're going to have negative infinity to 3. 3 has the right parentheses, so right, and shade it all the way down to negative infinity with an arrow. So next example, let's look at negative 2 is greater than or equal to x. So to get this into interval form, first thing we're going to do is get it into the less than direction. So x is less than or equal to negative 2. So that's going to turn into negative infinity. I don't know what that was, but that was not infinity. So let's try that again. Negative infinity, there we go, much better, is less than or equal to, or less than x. Remember, there's no or equal to ever with infinity. So negative infinity is less than x is less than or equal to negative 2. So getting that into interval notation, you're going to have negative infinity to negative 2. Parentheses always with infinity, and bracket because we have the or equal to. So then you're going to graph everything. So I have negative 2 with the right parentheses, or right bracket, and then shade all the way to negative infinity with an arrow. Okay, so now let's do a compound. So if we have 1 is less than x is less than or equal to 3, it's already written how we need it. So we have 1 and 3. 1 is less than strictly, so we've got the left parentheses. We have less than or equal to 3, so we have our bracket there. Move it on up and take a look. So at 1, we're going to put our left parentheses, and at 3, we're going to put our right bracket and shade everything in between. So that is from 1 to 3. Okay, so next we have graphing x is less than 2 and x is greater than or equal to negative 1. So this is an intersection, not a union, because we've got that and in there. So the first thing we have to do is a little bit more work because we need to put these two inequalities together to turn it into a compound inequality. So remember, the first step in doing that is you always want to get everything in the less than direction. So we have x is less than 2 and negative 1 is less than or equal to x. So then you line those up where the x's are with each other. So you have negative 1 is less than or equal to x, and x is less than 2. So then we can collapse them, if you remember that collapsing rule. So we've got negative 1 is less than or equal to x, which is less than 2. So then that interval form is going to give us negative 1 to 2, bracket, parentheses. So then we're on to the graphing step. So we have negative 1 with a left bracket, and we have 2 with a right parentheses, and shade in between. So that was graphing a compound inequality when you're given the two inequalities and they're not already put together. Then the last example here is doing a union of inequalities. So for this, again, remember you're going to be graphing two inequalities on the same number line. And so you know you're in a union situation because it's or. If it was an intersection for a compound inequality, it would be and. So or is telling us we've got this union. So first step is to get these into interval form. So x is greater than or equal to 2 is 2 is less than or equal to x, which is 2 is less than or equal to x, which is less than infinity, which gives you 2 to infinity. Then for x is less than or equal to negative 4, that's going to give you a negative infinity is less than x is less than or equal to negative 4, which is going to give you from negative, parentheses, always the parentheses. So parentheses for -8 all the way to -4 with a bracket. So then you're going to graph both sets. So for the first one, we have from 2 to infinity. And then for the second one, we have -4 all the way to negative infinity. So that's the union of those two. Okay, so quick summary. You follow the same steps. You just have to pay attention to if you're dealing with simple or compound or unions to see exactly what flavor it looks like, but the steps are always the same. So that's step 1. Going to change that inequality into interval form. That makes it so much easier to get in the graphing. Then step 2, you graph the numbers, but instead of dots, you use parentheses if you have less thans, and you use brackets if you have less than or equal to's, and it lines up with which one it is. So if you have one that's just less than and one that's less than or equal to, you just put them together in the way that makes sense. And for step 3, you shade the lines between the symbols. Now, if you had an infinity, which means there is no symbol on one end, so you shade with an arrow. So you start with wherever the number that you did graph is and shade all the way to the end and put the arrow on the end, or if you're going that way, the arrow on that end. So remember, though, the symbol always tells you what direction to go. And so what I mean by that is when you have -2 to 3, when you graph that on the number line, you're graphing this. Well, it contains what you're going to shade. So you're always going to shade in that direction. Or if you have parentheses that way, you're always going to shade in that direction. So your symbols contain whatever you're going to be shading. And then remember that to graph a union of inequalities, you just graph it twice. That's all it is. You take the two inequalities, put them both on that same number line. And there you go. That's it. That's all there is to graphing inequalities. I hope this video was helpful. Please like it if it was. Also, subscribe to our channel to be the first to know about all of our new content. And always remember that if it's math, we have the solution.